everyone. Just checking. Everyone, just checking. Can you hear? Yeah, great. Welcome to the session on cybercrime law and legislative developments and trends in the region. My name is Ramanjit Singh Cheema. I'll be moderator for this session. I'll give you a little bit of context of this session, but before that, I want to just introduce you to our participants. We have three participants here, one participant who will be joining us remotely, and also one person from here in the audience who will also be talking a bit about a project in this space. But without further ado, let me just introduce everyone who's here in person. Gayatri is with the Association for Progressive Communications and leads the Impact project there. Gayatri is a lawyer by training. Malvika Jara, many of you may know, is the Executive Director of the Digital Asia Hub. Malvika is also a fellow and been associated with the Center for Internet and Society as well as the Berkman Center. Ananta Sharma, who is last up here, is our policy fellow with Access Now. She's been a South Asia public policy fellow, and Ananta has also been a legislative aide to a member of parliament in India. Joining us remotely is Haroon Bullock with Bytes for All, and Haroon leads advocacy and policy efforts at Bytes for All, and will be joining us remotely. We'll also have one more person assisting Gayatri who will be speaking in between a bit, Geeta, who is there. But without further ado, let me give you a little bit of further background about why we got together here. The idea behind the session also has come out of the fact that you've all heard specific discussions around cybercrime legislation, whether it's Section 66A, the erstwhile section in India, discussions around the earlier prevention, what was called the PECB, popularly known as the Cybercrime Bill in Pakistan, which is passed and is now the Cybercrime Act there. You've had discussions around countries as diverse as the Philippines to Myanmar to others. And what's been interesting in many of these conversations is that it's very rare that we get discussed at one level. Are there trends we're seeing legislatively across the region? Are there top-level concerns with respect to how this may impact rights, particularly privacy, free expression, other principles that we might hold dear? The very few rare regional conversations on cybercrime tend to be either about cybercrime cooperation, especially particularly in the law enforcement space, or there may be conversations around cybercrime trends in terms of number of crimes occurring and the idea that, look, we need to take urgent action. But there's very little discussion on the actual contents of many of these very specific national conversations. And the idea of this session is to talk a bit about what each panelist is seeing in terms of top-level concern in their sphere of responsibility. And with that, we'll first start out with Haroon, who is going to talk a bit about Pakistan and what's happened to the cybercrime law there. Haroon is joining remotely, so I'm just going to just check if we can unmute him and let him speak. Haroon, are you there? Yes. So while we fix that, I'm going to instead then just start a bit with Ananta. And as I discussed, there's cybercrime legislation that's either been passed in many countries, and in other countries there's draft law that's being proposed. One development that most people have not been tracking again has been a particular bill that's been proposed in Bangladesh, and I know there are also participants and speakers from Bangladesh here at APrIGF, many of whom may have thoughts about the current forms of the law and what may take place. But Ananta wanted to give a little bit of top-level analysis in terms of what the contents of that law talk about, and it's interesting because it's a law which is specifically titled Digital Security, although it came out of the original cybercrime conversations. So with that, I'll give Ananta space to give a few comments on that, and we also then try and bring Haroon in after that to talk about Pakistan.
Hi. So the Draft Digital Security Act 2000... hello? Can you hear me now? Hello? Hello? Yeah. So the Draft Digital Security Act 2016, it was...
Hello? I think we have Haroon. Haroon, just to check, can you hear us? Haroon, if you can hear us, just indicate yes.
Yeah, I can hear you, but there is a lot of noise in the background.
Haroon, let us just try and sort that out. We'll have Ananta talk first and then have you join in after that. And we'll just try and figure out your audio in the meantime. If you could mute in the meantime, that would be great.
Hello. So the draft Digital Security Act, as we all know, that the Bangladesh ICT law already exists, Bangladesh ICT law 2006, and because of the growing concerns regarding digital security in Bangladesh, the government decided to form the Digital Security Act, which is the draft as of now. So upon my analysis, I stumbled upon a lot of troubling definitions. First of all. Then there are a lot of definitions which restrict freedom of expression. They also allow for surveillance in the name of national security, and there is no form of judicial oversight whatsoever. Then there is the Digital Security Agency, which is the competent authority formed by the government, which looks into all the digital security concerns in the country. And that digital security, the Director General of the Digital Security Agency, he has the authority to order any private entity to give away information in matters of national security. The fact here is that there's no kind of judicial oversight whatsoever in this particular draft. Lots of violations for freedom of expression, and the definitions are very broad. And so basically, appropriate safeguards have not been provided for the citizens. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananta. We're going to just try Harun again. So Harun, if you can unmute and just try speaking now. We'll just see if your audio is working fine. Great. Harun, speak now.
Hello.
Great. We can hear you, Harun. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Raman. Since passage of this Cybercrime Act, that is referred as Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act 2016, the government has done everything to stifle expression in Pakistan, and these measures that they have taken, they include everything from monitoring online activities, summoning social media users, activists, and carry out investigations, confiscation of their devices, and even in some cases earlier in this year, we have seen the abductions of 5 bloggers, and they were subject to torture as well. Then we have also witnessed the cases where journalists and activists were also threatened on phone calls for their expression online, and especially if their political dissent. And some of the activists who were also making commentary on religious issues, they were also threatened, and their activities are monitored. And especially since January 2017, a comprehensive campaign against blasphemy originating from social media platforms and websites has been in progress, which has the patronage of Interior Ministry and Pakistan Telecommunication Authority, who publicly have been making statements and running paid media campaigns and sending mobile messages to warn social media activists, users, for producing and sharing of objectionable, quote-unquote, objectionable content. And now this objectionable term is very vague and broad, like anything can be referred as objectionable content. This objectionable content may also include alleged blasphemy content and any criticism on so-called national security, military, and other institutions, criticism on courts, or criticism on friendly states, which is the language actually of the Cybercrime Act in Pakistan. Specifically, these terminologies are mentioned in Section 37. However, the government is more focusing on social media users who are carrying out religious commentary and expressing their political content online. So this all began from the abduction of 5 bloggers and who were kept into custody for 3 weeks and were also subject of torture. During this custody, a smear campaign was also run by the cyber armies promoting the agenda and narratives of establishment, and that campaign was to paint these bloggers as blasphemers who were actually criticizing the military and other institutions for their wrongdoings or their policies. This campaign further aggravated actually the hatred against progressive voices in the country, because it certainly has the patronage of government and its institution in general, and it has cultivated the environment of intolerance, which has resulted in violence cases as well, where we have seen one of the cases was related to one of the students of Mardan University, and he was actually killed because of his expression and criticism on the university administration in the name of blasphemy, which were the wrong allegation against him leveled by the people who were actually against him. So in the meantime, a petition was also registered when the bloggers were abducted in the Islamabad High Court against this blogger, and where the judge dramatized the whole case and explicitly expressed his religious bias during the proceedings, and ordered the government to take measures to block alleged blasphemy expression online. He in fact also remarked that if he would have wished, he would have blocked all the social media to protect the sanctity of Islam and its prophet. After that, on the directions of Interior Minister Chaudhry Nisar Ali Khan, FIA, which is the Federal Investigation Agency and the authorized investigation agency under the Cybercrime Act of Pakistan, and the anti-terrorism wing, they started crackdown against social media. They have been monitoring and tracking down social media users and summoning them at police stations for investigations. There are also actually, it's a very threatening trend that when states start give patronage to these sort of campaigns to stifle expression for what they believe that it's objectionable material or speech is being exercised by people. So in this context, Government of Pakistan, actually FIA, Federal Investigation Agency, they have produced a list of 100 activists and social media activists and political activists, and also this list also includes the names of some of the journalists who are very active in criticizing and exercising political dissent. And this list is being made public on social media. So what they have been doing? So these people whose names are in the list, they are being projected as blasphemer, and blasphemy is a very very sensitive issue in Pakistan, and we have seen that anyone who has been presented as a blasphemer, the decisions of these allegations are done on the road and instead of in the court. So it's a very threatening trend. Another thing that we have seen, it relates to rise of cyber armies who are closely affiliated with the state narrative. Their job is to harass, bully, intimidate social media users expressing political dissent, and make disappear any narrative which is confronting the state narrative actually. So since PECA, we have also seen a rise in blocking and filtering of online content as well, and we have seen that PTA, Pakistan Telecommunication Authority, and FIA, they are making excessive requests to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to block and censor online content under PECA, that is the Cybercrime Bill of Pakistan. So these all trends are very threatening for freedom of expression in Pakistan, and definitely they are having chilling effects on the expression.
Thank you so much for that, Harun. We might come back with some specific questions as well based on how Pakistani authorities and others are using the law there. But with that, I think that's actually a good setup for Gayatri, who's been tracking developments across the region. Gayatri, many of these developments happen sometimes in the shadow of legal frameworks. Sometimes legal frameworks are used for that. So could you talk a bit about the APC, what members are seeing, as well as the framework you're working on?
All right. Thanks, Raman. I want to start with a slightly more fundamental question, right? What do we mean by, let's leave the question of what do we mean by cybercrime. Well, that's a different discussion as such. But one thing that's clear is that cybercrime or the legislation on cybercrime is oftentimes not one comprehensive legislation, yeah? Cybercrime is pretty much broken and is covered by a whole gamut of laws that we all have in different jurisdictions. Another point that I wanted to clarify is that it's not only laws like, for instance, the ICT law in Bangladesh or the PCB law in Pakistan that's applied to online spaces. It's also the traditional offline laws we have. So, for instance, the penal legislation we have, any other legislation that has been traditionally used for offline activities or crimes is also used in online spaces. So what, in a sense, happens is that there is sort of a convenient play. When the government kind of wants to use an offline legislation to address an online activity, they do that. And then when it helps them, they use the online act as well. So say, for instance, if you have a specific Cybercrimes Act, you use the Cybercrimes Act, but you also use the Penal Act, no? Like, for instance, the Indian Penal Code, you use that as well. What happens in these cases is that oftentimes these two acts are not really complementary. They have contradictory provisions. Definition of crimes itself can be quite different in the two acts, yeah? So then it creates a lot of chaos. Now, this is also what we're facing in Pakistan as well as Bangladesh and India and Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and many of the countries in Asia. Now, therefore, we kind of, at APC, what we decided was that we kind of took a look at all the different activities that's being criminalized on the internet. And we decided to have a meaningful sort of analysis or understanding of it. We decided to pick one particular right and look at it a little more seriously. We decided to go with the right to freedom of expression. Because oftentimes that's the right that's most targeted online, yeah? And what we decided to do is that we also decided to break it up a little bit because it's hard to look at different aspects of legislation right away when we're dealing with one particular right. So for the first stage, we decided to look only at the laws and how the laws came about and what they are saying. There's a whole other side to it, which is how the laws are applied. And that's the point Haroon was making as well, because a lot of these definitions are extremely vague and overbroad. So then how courts are interpreting it, whether you see sort of a reactionism there, no? What we certainly can say is that the online space kind of exploded, no? And states as well as people are still finding it hard to sort of reconcile our values, how we exist otherwise, with what the internet is giving us a space to do. And in that rush to kind of address that, there's a lot of things that's being done without really thinking through in the sense of what is going to be the long-term impact of that. Now, with this study, of course, Asia is too wide, no? So we picked about 6 countries in Asia. We're looking at India, Malaysia, Pakistan, Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia. And this study we're doing with the Digital Asia Hub as well as the Southeast Asian Press Alliance. We're looking at, we're starting with the starting point of it is to look at a range of expression that's being criminalized. So, or what is the basis on which it's being criminalized, no? For example, blasphemy, hate speech, defamation, national security issues, public order. These are all some of the most common ones. But what is also striking is the attack on sexual expression, specifically through two aspects, right? One is obscenity laws, and 2 is outraging modesty of women, which you see in traditionally called British colonized jurisdictions. We're looking at the definition of all of these different aspects and seeing how these terms are being defined and what kind of expression is being covered by it. But another very important aspect of this is to look at what is the punishment or the penal provision that's being ascribed to each one of these offenses. And to also get a sense of, let's take that for online spaces. So if I say commit blasphemy online, then what's the punishment that's being prescribed for me? And if I commit blasphemy offline, what is the punishment that's being prescribed for me? And how are they dealing with it? Now, the reason why the study is important, or studies like this are important, is that throughout Asia, we are sort of in a norm-setting phase when it comes to how we deal with the internet from a legal perspective. And for us to get an understanding of what is the jurisprudence that's eventually going to evolve as a result of all these legislation is really crucial. And this sort of an initiative is not only new to Asia, no, because one of our members, the Social Media Exchange in Lebanon, has already done the study for the Arab region, and there are studies like this that are ongoing for different regions. It's really important for us to then compare these studies across regions and see where we are falling, in different places. So I think that's sort of the starting point. But I think another really important piece to this puzzle is to look at how strategic litigation and how jurisprudence around internet rights, which is essentially the human rights that we exercise in digital spaces, is being shaped. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. And in fact, I just noted Gayatri's last ending point is perhaps the most understated. There are fantastic strategic litigation efforts on across the region. And one of the challenges I think we all face is there is very little opportunity to sometimes learn about what people are doing. The best litigators, by the way, are not the ones who will be there at APrIGF. They're often the ones directly involved in cases, will not be able to speak to this. But that's, I think, the challenge. How are we able to share this? How can we find out more of what's going on? Not just on sometimes the black letter of the law, as Gayatri mentioned, but in terms of how legal frameworks, norms are being used. And with that, I'm going to toss it to Malvika, because this is like the tough question, right? Sometimes people say, is there an Asia region to study when it comes to this? How can people collaborate and share and work on this? And I know you're partners with APC on this, but perhaps we talk a bit about that, saying what next in terms of how people respond to this, and how can we both, not just in the Indian governance space, but perhaps in the public interest community, be able to advance more effective analysis of what's happening in this cybercrime space and protecting the rights that we see so valuable.
Thanks, Raman. So we at the Digital Asia Hub, by design, we're a hub. So we'll never have 50 or 100 researchers working in-house. The idea is that we partner with in-country experts who understand their context, their region, their language much better than anyone we could hire. So the whole idea is to grow the network, to work with experts in-country, and also to sort of share knowledge. So we're all about knowledge sharing, capacity building, and doing networked research. So those are our three core aims. And I think one of the things that's really interesting in the sort of cybercrime space is, well, a couple of things. One is that I think you often conflate cybersecurity and cybercrime. People talk about them as if they're the same thing when actually they're not. You know, you can say that certain elements of cybercrime are part of a cybersecurity strategy, but to think of them as the same thing and to refer to cybercrime law as if it's just about security or the other way around, I think it really does the whole field a disservice when people don't even understand what it is we're talking about. And, you know, Gaia alluded to the fact that, you know, even the definitions can be really complicated and we don't all agree on what it is. But I think we can agree at a very fundamental level that cybersecurity and cybercrime are not the same thing. And they have elements in common, but they're not the same thing. And I think what's also really interesting is that at a time when crime, the old-fashioned crime that didn't involve computers, is at an all-time low in most countries that we look at, right? People feel safer than they ever have been. Other kinds of crime are diminishing everywhere, despite the rhetoric in a lot of countries that, oh my God, it's all scary and, you know, there's all terrorism everywhere and we all need to shut everything down and kill every kind of freedom we have. But what you see in parallel is just when, you know, regular crime statistics are falling to all-time lows, cybercrime is going through the roof. You know, so regular crime might be 10% in a country, but 70% is now cybercrime. And I think what's happening is you see a little bit of a gap with institutions that used to address this. Policemen, cyber criminals are kind of a new thing for them, right? Some countries are better at it than others. Singapore might be really good at it. Myanmar or Laos may be really terrible at it because they haven't had to deal with it before. It's very sophisticated, it's new, it's something they're trying to get a hold of. And this also comes at a time when in a lot of countries, we're defunding these kinds of activities. We're investing less money in critical infrastructure, we're investing less money with public services. Policemen are getting lower and lower wages, but we somehow magically expect them to have PhDs in cybersecurity and cybercrime overnight. They don't have the tools or the technology, and they often turn to private companies to help, you know, which comes up with a whole set of other issues. I think the third thing that's really interesting for me when I look at it across the region is we talk about the need to tackle cybercrime, but we don't talk about the need to have data protection and privacy standards and laws in place in parallel. So a lot of cybercrime either comes from hacking, it comes from theft, it comes from, all kinds of errors, fraud, impersonation, all kinds of other things, many of which can be stemmed if you have standards around data protection. If you have principles saying data minimization, don't collect more than what you need, delete it once you don't need it anymore. Why are we creating stockpiles of data that are there for hackers to want to, you create this honeypot and then say, oh no, you should be disciplined about not attacking it. That's completely unrealistic. So the same countries that are pushing for really strong cybercrime legislation, if you ask them what they're doing about data protection, it's like, ooh, I never thought about this before. So I think that kind of disconnect is really crazy, because we keep incentivizing and encouraging the collection of data. We tell people that data is gold and data is the new oil, and without data you can't do anything. We have this sort of fetishization around data, and at the same time, we don't create systems that prevent it leaking. We don't tackle the cybersecurity side of things and the data protection side of things, but we want magically crime to be eradicated overnight. So I think if we want cybercrime legislation to work, Gaia mentioned how intersectional this is and how, the problem bleeds into other areas that are not just about cybercrime, and where the acts that are being criminalized are also criminalized across different pieces of legislation. They could be economic offenses. I live in Hong Kong, try and open a bank account if you're an NGO. Good luck, right? They assume you're a criminal from the get-go, and they put you through all kinds of compliance checks, which is great if you're trying to combat fraud and money laundering. But what about the little guy on the street who isn't actually a cyber criminal, but is being treated like one? So the solutions come from different sectors, often disproportionate, and we know that when you sort of mention crime, it's a very passionate thing. People sort of think we're, cleaning a country of crime. It's a big public service. We want to secure our borders. We want to prevent terrorism. These are all horrible things that are happening. So of course it's a very emotive, visceral response, and people will accept all kinds of invasions into human rights and into civil liberties when you raise this big specter of, oh my God, we're under threat all the time. We have a traffic light system. It's now security level red. It's now a Chanel lipstick red. It's not even regular red. It's like it's no longer orange. When we keep coming up with this sort of very scary dystopian rhetoric, it's easy for people to say, oh, maybe, I don't want to be that idiot who says, oh, we shouldn't have strong laws about this. But what kind of laws are we creating? And are we criminalizing behavior that really shouldn't be on the radar at all under this guise of, cybercrime? And we also know that cybercrime is often used as a pretext for tackling things that are socially conservative issues. You don't want pornography, even the kind that doesn't tackle children, even like regular good pornography for entertainment, oh, I read only Playboy for the articles, that kind of pornography. Even that gets, swept up in this thing. So people want to criminalize different kinds of activities that they deem antisocial. You want to crack down on LGBT communities. Why don't we use cybercrime rather than using sexual oppression laws? Right? So I think when you look at cybercrime, you need to have a very holistic lens about what we're classifying as crimes. Could they be better off dealt with as civil issues? Maybe there's a monetary damage that's adequate. You don't need to criminalize this act at all. And I think that's why projects like the one Gaia mentioned, this impact project, is so important, because it's literally sifting out those strands and saying these things should fall into a criminal bucket. These things are really much better off dealt with as civil things. We have systems, we have laws that deal with them. We have institutions that are really good at dealing with economic issues, right? Or consumer protection issues, or negligence, or fraud. Why are we not sort of seeing this as sort of a spectrum? So I think making everything a criminal act just because it's easier to legislate, it's very hard to push back against. I think it ends up being, it has a tendency to lean towards the draconian. It needn't. There are good examples of how that can be done. But I think there is this tendency of over-criminalizing and of having very broad legislation. And you have to have some sympathy for lawmakers as well, right? Because you want to keep definitions as broad as possible to cover things that you don't know yet, right? Because criminals are evolving. They use technology way better than official government institutions do. So it's always a bit of an arms race. You're always trying to play catch up. And you try to crack down on one kind of activity, it's going to move to a different forum, right? It's kind of like whack-a-mole, right? You whack this one here, it opens up in another hole somewhere else. And it is a constant game of catching up. But I think when you look at everything through the lens of crime, you're actually going to lose out on a lot of things that could be very well solved using other instruments that we already have. So I think this kind of project where we're looking first at the impact on free expression and saying, are there bits of expression that are being criminalized that shouldn't be? That's sort of one starting point. But you could look at other kinds of issues that are being criminalized that really have no business being considered a crime at all. So I think those are the kinds of issues that we want to look at. And I think we're really interested in looking at it at a regional level, because if you look at it purely through a national lens, there are certain things that might make sense, that might justify it. But I think if you telescope it out one level, you can actually look at trends, even simple trends that are really valuable, like who are the vendors selling all these solutions to governments, right? Who's providing all the surveillance technology? Is it the same two companies going and convincing government that we really need to use surveillance as a tool to crack down on crime, not because it's effective, but because they have a product to sell? And then governments also play this arms race with each other, saying, oh, Singapore has it, so maybe we should, then we can become like Singapore in every other way. We're not doing the things that turn us into Singapore in other ways. We're not creating smart cities. We're not having enabling legislation about other things. We're not providing social welfare and good health care, but we want to be like them only when it comes to tackling crime. So I think it's really important that we look at good examples and bad examples. And I think I'll end by saying, in Silicon Valley and in other parts of the world, there's this huge sort of mantra among startups that, you should fail faster and you should, talk about failure, and failure is a great, wonderful thing. There's a huge positive spin. And they come to Asia and say we should do the same thing here. And I think, do you understand anything about Asia if you're saying we should take pride in failure? People will kill themselves before admitting they failed. We're embarrassed as a society about so many things. We're not going to admit that we failed. You lose your job in a government hierarchy if you say you failed. There is no culture that promotes people sharing the terrible lessons, right? As a community, as a region, we need to get really good at talking about this. And I always use this example saying that if you want to talk about things that can go wrong in the internet space and startups, if you talk about failure, it has no resonance in sort of Chinese cultures or Indian cultures. But if you talk about it as gambling, saying, we gamble for Chinese New Year, we gamble for, Diwali in India, we take risks. That kind of risk-taking is good risk-taking, right? And people can say, oh yeah, that's how startups work, some win, some lose when you talk about innovation. Why can't we find Asian metaphors and Asian things that are more relevant to our social context? We're not just importing some other person's idea of what it means to tackle crime and to tackle these sort of social issues. So I think that's what we're trying to look at across the region, to look at trends, to look at ways that we can make this conversation a more equitable one and something that actually has resonance for us in the region to tackle the kinds of crimes that might be emerging here as a solution to things that aren't working elsewhere. So I hope some of that would help solve the problem.
Thank you for that, Malvika. I'll just bookend a couple of things that Malvika flagged, particularly on the connection about privacy, data protection with cybercrime. Often, in fact, maybe the same officials even involved in conversations, but they won't talk about it in a similar way. There's a unique opportunity this year because the International Conference for Privacy and Data Protection Commissioners is coming back to the region after a long time, and they're having a meeting in the region. And many of you, I would ask, nationally should ask your governments, how are they engaging, who are they sending? I still find it very telling that many governments who are willing to send officials everywhere do not send people for the Privacy Commissioners Conference if they don't have a data protection authority, and even there they limit their resources. We've talked about data security and cybercrime being different, and that's one thing, again, I think many people would note officials in that space may be the same people, but they will still just often try and say that let's talk about it differently, or let's conflate everything together. With that, I know we have a little bit of time, extra time, because we started a bit late because of the previous session. So with that, let's take questions. Just in the interest of time, maybe we'll collect 2, 3 and then take it to the panel. I also encourage you to address any questions to the remote participant. If you had questions for Haroon about what's happening in Pakistan, or any other points the panelists mentioned, please just announce yourself and there's a mic there. I'll also check if there are any remote participants speaking. But with that, maybe we'll collect 2, 3 questions.
Can I start? This is Mubashir Srigana from Pakistan. I've got a little question, but more a comment. Actually, you can't have a set of cultural value as a standard for whole world. In one part of world, child honor protection is a subject discussed widely. But in other part of world, you can't discuss because of, you talk about contents availability like Harun was mentioning, but because Pakistan, they are banning and restricting the access to that content, which is, prohibited for, not encouraged for children to see. My actually question is about cross-border cooperation of cybercrimes because it's more important for me as a discussion. In recent past, we have got only one set of standard. I can say that Budapest Convention, because most of the countries do not. They have got reservations on these things as well. But what actually I suggest, I recommend is to UN should intervene. They should come up with some, set of standard. They can amend their charter. I can say that starting from Article 51 and followed by Article 2 and 4 and imposing, taking advantage of Article 2.7, they can, intervene and they can take care of these matters like in whatever is happening in cyberspace to come up with, like some preventive diplomacy for cross-border cooperation in cyberspace. Thank you.
Thank you. That is one comment, one question, one suggestion. Other speakers, and just ask you just if possible to limit yourself to one question or comment if possible, just in the interest of time.
Francis Acero, National Privacy Commission, Philippines. On behalf of the Commission, I guess I'd like to thank the panel for recognizing the importance of data protection and privacy in the whole spectrum of how these things happen. Just want to note that at least in my experience, where cybercrime legislation is headed, they take other issues which are definitely within the realm of cybercrime, such as child pornography and I guess hate speech, and use that to try and rein in other dissenting speech. And sometimes that hate speech is passed through non-state actors. So there are people who try to suppress dissent using agents that are not part of government. I guess the question is, how do you see data protection legislation moving forward in the region? Because we'd like to reach out also laterally and create a more stable ecosystem.
I think we'll take one more question and then maybe we can address those. So one more question.
Hi, mine is more of a comment. Hi, I'm Smita. I work with an organization called Point of View in India. We actually are working on a final draft of a research in which we looked at Section 67 of the Information Technology Act. It's a multi-pronged, we used multiple methodologies.
Sorry, could I ask one thing? Could you explain Section 67 of the Indian IT Act to those who are not familiar?
Of course, sorry. Section 67 of the Information Technology Act basically says that publication or transmission of obscene material using an electronic medium is a crime. That's the provision of it, and they haven't specified what is obscene or any of that. In recent times, particularly, Section 67 is being extensively used, and using media reports, National Crime Records Bureau data, as well as case studies, we have we worked on our research. Some of the things which came up is that Section 67 in recent times is being used more and more as a tool for censorship, including political, religious, as well as sexual censorship in the online space. It's also used often by politicians to silence people who speak up against them on social media. It's being used as a mass dumping, a dustbin of sorts for any crime which has even a remote digital component. The problem with this is, of course, multi-pronged. It's not rights-based. Because you don't say what is obscene, it's also very moralistic in its very framing of it. We're actually presenting the research along with our partner organizations from Nepal and Sri Lanka at 4 o'clock today in this room. It's an open forum, so please come for it. But I thought I should say a little on this here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've had two comments and a question. I'll just re-up them. You may have noted. One was on just commenting about different socio-cultural contexts, but then also a comment later about how laws on obscenity are being used against people in the region, and more data on that, 4 p.m. this room later. And then a question really on cross-border cooperation. Can we move beyond the Budapest Convention? Should the UN intervene in this space? And then a question, where are data protection laws in the region going to? So would people like to address it? I would like to talk about Budapest. Sure. I'll take one thing on Budapest because someone talked about it. So those who are unfamiliar, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime was essentially the Council of Europe's great attempt to try and show cybercrime cooperation, uniform standards, and not just in Europe. So it is one of the few bits of treaties which the US also signed on to, and many other countries have in the stages of potentially signing on. Many of you who follow international discussions on this are familiar. The US government has been, at least in the previous administration, very keen for many countries in the region to sign on. I know of accession talks involving Singapore, India, and others. What might be particularly of interest to communities outside of government and civil society is that there's actually an additional protocol being drafted for the Budapest Convention, which is being formally discussed this year, which would be about mutual legal assistance and where can companies and others perhaps directly cooperate with entities. Many law enforcement people would love that. In fact, many lawyers, and I am a lawyer by training, I would also really like that. The rights lawyer in me is very concerned because that's also basically law enforcement directly cooperating with companies, and that can place people in particular situations. And that's something where it might be interesting for, again, many organizations in this region to engage. I can share from Access, working with other organizations, we're just starting to engage with some of the US and European discussions on this. It might be very good for an Asia-Pacific, in whatever sense, civil society conversation around where would countries like to go to that. There were two specific questions out of that. Should the UN be involved? And then where is data protection legislation going? So maybe first one to you, Gayatri, and then second one, Malvika, would you like to talk about data protection?
About the UN, yeah, I think that's a really loaded question. So I think we're going to need a whole other 1 hour to deal with that. So let's park that for now. But I just wanted to say about the data protection law. I'm really glad a representative from Philippines is here because that's actually a really good example from the region we have for addressing data protection, right? Indonesia is currently drafting, drafting a bill on data protection, and we are doing a research in Pakistan that Harun is also involved in, which looks at mapping good standards on data protection laws and comparing those good standards against what is not necessarily even a semi-good draft in Pakistan, because Pakistan has a draft Data Protection Act as well. So I think that's also one area where we really need regional exchange to look at what are the overall good practices we have, what is the current examples we have from the region, you know. So I think that's one good area. But I also wanted to take one other the question about these values and cultures and all of that, right? Personally, I'm really wary of this Asian values, you know, Asian culture, coming from an Asian culture perspective. I would really I have several questions about that. Now, what is Asian value? I mean, there's not a single value that we can say that's a cross-border Asian value. So I think we have to be really careful when we are even saying Asian experience or Asian perspective. We really have to take into account the fact that there are multiple experiences and multiple perspectives within that. So it's not necessarily the cultural context from that point of view, rather than realities, no, the ground realities that I'd be more concerned about. And it's precisely these cross-border and data protection related questions that bring us back to the key question here. Do we need more laws? Because drafting a law is the easiest thing for legislators to do, because that's like, you know, for every problem there's, okay, let's come up with a law. And that's also the easiest superficial solution they can provide us. When we come to them with a problem, they say, okay, I've come up with a law for it. But that does nothing, no? So then the question is, for many of these things that we're talking about as cyber crimes, we have to really question, do we even need a new law about this when there's already existing laws? The problem with that, the coming up with the new laws, is not only coming up with new definitions, but you're coming up with new limitations, which you know, we've established over years and years of jurisprudence and international advocacy and national advocacy.
The joke that like many police officers sometimes say is that, oh, there's a new law, I don't need to look at this earlier court ruling saying that I can't arrest someone because of free speech concerns. Parliament has passed a new provision, I don't need to care. So that's something that's concerning.
I was going to add that, like, in terms of what's happening in the region in terms of data protection and privacy, two things that are happening in the West are influencing change here. One is the new GDPR, which is forcing people who have inherited their regimes from the Western idea of privacy, or countries that have sort of looked to data protection standards in the European Union and cut and paste certain elements, principles, standards from that, who are now saying, wait, my whole law is based on the old, data protection directive. Now there's this new GDPR, which is overhauling everything we know about data protection. Do I now need to go and change my own law to now be in compliance, or is there going to be a disconnect? So I think the GDPR is forcing a lot of people to confront the issue. And I think companies are leading this fight as well, saying, oh God, do I now need to do different things to be in compliance because I'm dealing with data around the world? So I think companies are actually helping to push for more global compliance standards. I think the GDPR plays a huge role in what's going to happen. And the other thing is the evolution of this whole right to be forgotten, which again is a very sort of sexy, interesting part of the debate. I think people are getting very concerned about that and saying, wait, are you going to do geo-blocking on content? Like, does that right to be forgotten only apply in Madrid or in Europe? Like, does it apply to me here? And I think people are also thinking, well, maybe we don't have it yet. Why don't we have it? Should we have a right to be forgotten in different Asian contexts? So I think those two trends that we're seeing, and I think as of yesterday, the fact that passenger name recognition data that airlines share, that's been deemed illegal in Europe. That might actually bleed into a lot of discussions about how we share intelligence from a cybercrime perspective. So I think those are three things to watch out for in terms of regional trends.
And I'll add two things to that after Ananta, though.
Yeah. With respect to data protection development happening in India, the government claims that they are currently in the process of drafting one, although we haven't seen a draft yet. And currently there's a very important judgment which is going to be passed. The Supreme Court is currently deciding whether Indians have the right to privacy or not. Maybe Raman can add more to that. Yeah.
And that's what I was going to note, that a lot of stuff that we look at this space is not necessarily in national legislatures, it's before courts. And you notice that in a complicated way, it's either courts or enforcement actions. For example, right to be forgotten in Hong Kong was not a policy discussion, but the Privacy Commissioner took it up as an issue and looked at it in terms of an enforcement action. In India, as Ananta mentioned, in a sense, the government has had a very private privacy act, a privacy bill, because it's not been public despite 11 drafts since 2011, or 3 of which were leaked. So data breach is occurring apparently. But they're now being forced with the fact that the Indian Supreme Court has formed a 9-judge bench looking at whether Indians have a fundamental right to privacy. And now whatever comes out of that will color what Parliament will pass. And in a sense will link it to norms, which is also maybe a point to us, right? That we need to get ahead of the game. Sometimes it might be better to come up with clear principles and statements and then let that actually shape particular legal conversations. Because I think, as Gayatri mentioned, people will pass laws that may not always, in fact, always be a good thing. Even if you pass a law, I think, particularly in the privacy space, we've seen that that's not yet enough. Is the Data Protection Authority actually empowered? Is there enough resources there? Do other agencies actually seriously listen to them? These are constraints. And in fact, in an ironic way, we have kind of in the echoes of what Europe is doing, because the GDPR is very clear. And I think what's also clear the last 2 years, as you've seen from the Max Schrems ruling, is that the European Court of Justice will enforce it to the point that they will tear up international treaties if they do not match European data protection requirements. And in a sense, we are now in that echo that the European Commission, in a sense, tells many governments in the region whether they're reaching a standard or not. And perhaps we need to get ahead of that game. And perhaps, therefore, it's good for us to have that particular conversation around what sort of privacy standards do we want. On cybercrime specifically, is it engaging with issues about privacy? Is it not just about a standalone law? Is it about previous provisions? And how do we engage with that? Now, there are many interesting comments, and I know we're out of time. So what I'm going to do is end that, and again flag that at 4 p.m. there is research. Please come and talk to people about that. Many individual people on this panel have stuff we can share. Access, in fact, has a document on the right to be forgotten conversation globally, and I know Stanford CIS has also been doing research in this space, and you may want to come and speak to people. And I think there's one researcher you also wanted to point out who's working with you. But
yeah. I'm sorry, I thought Geeta was going to speak, but suddenly she disappeared from there. Yeah, so Geeta is the person who's coordinating this entire research. If you'd like to know more about it, please meet Geeta. But Geeta will also be chairing a session tomorrow morning between 9 to 10, 10:30, 9 to 10:30. So please come to that session and we can talk more about the research there.
And I'm going to say thank you, not say goodbye, because we're here to be, come and talk to us over the lunch break or talk to us in other sessions. But thank you all. Thank you, Haroon, for joining us from Pakistan. And thank you, everyone, for staying.
Thank you all for staying through the lunch break.
Chest.